So I have to ask you a question. Are dogs man's best friend or man's best snack? Now, if you're watching this and you haven't read the articles ahead of time, you may be shocked by my question. I'll give you a chance to go ahead and pause the video here to check out the articles linked and the video linked on the screen now. So now we know who our friend here is. Gus Kenworthy. He's an Olympic athlete, British born, and he skied for the American team during the Sochi Olympics. In the video, you could see he was rescuing dogs from a dog farm in South Korea. In South Korea, these dog farms are used to produce dog meat for food. The Olympic athlete was seen as a hero for rescuing these dogs and shutting down the farm, noting its deplorable conditions and the cruelty of the dogs there. Mr. Kenworthy also said, yes, there's an argument to be made that eating dogs is part of Korean culture, and while I don't personally agree with it, I do agree that it's not my place to impose Western ideals on the people here. Noting these differences, he still went ahead and shut down the farm. On the other side of this argument is South Korean reporter Jun Lee. Jun Lee mentions the hypocrisy of a Western individual, noting the animal cruelty and the deplorable kitchen conditions of the South Korean dog farm, comparing it to that of the chicken market. He also states that the dog meat is a dying cuisine, and he also continues to say the imposition of these Western standards puts a strong spotlight on a dying stereotype among Korean people that I think is unfair and misrepresentative of culture. So who do you agree with? Is there right and wrong here? The important takeaway from this case is differences in perception are hugely important when you're a manager. Managing these perceptions are even more difficult. In this video, we're going to define culture, how it applies to us as managers, and what frameworks we can use to help give culture some structure. Now, culture can range from the language we use, the religious beliefs we have, and even the food we eat, as we saw in the previous example, and we'll see in some future examples. These aspects affect not only how we communicate with others, but is in essence a part of who we are. As managers, understanding culture is a key factor to success. So with that, let's jump in. There are countless examples within food of cultural differences. Can we convince you to maybe step out of your comfort zone and eat some insects? Now again, I'll challenge you to take a step back and listen. Insects are a great source of food, and many are doing research into how we can use insects as a sustainable food source. In the video I'm linking right now, I'd like you to check it out and see if I can change your mind. So what do we think? Insects are the new cuisine now, right? Now, I'm not asking you to go out on an insect-only diet. That's not the point of this video anyways. I mentioned before, food is only one aspect of culture, so let's focus in on the actual subject. What do we define culture as? Well, there's multiple characteristics. Taking these characteristics, learned, shared, transgenerational, pattern, pervasive, symbolic, and adaptive, we can come up with a definition of culture. Culture is acquired knowledge that people use to interpret experience and generate social behavior. This knowledge forms values, creates attitudes, and influences behavior. We can break up culture into three distinct categories. The first, symbols, stories, rituals, and behaviors. The second is our norms and values. These are our priorities about what we prefer, directs our commitment, choices, and behaviors. Finally is our assumptions and beliefs. Starting at the top, symbols, stories, rituals, and behaviors are observable but very easy to misinterpret. The second part, norms and values, is our most effective source to understanding culture. And finally, assumptions and beliefs, which are very difficult to assess. So for us as managers, it's really important that we focus in on the norms and values. Now, as we understand culture, we learn that it's quite difficult to understand. So how can we as managers break that down? Culture is a difficult, all-encompassing topic to understand. So to help create cultural profiles, managers use these three main cultural framework models. One is the Social Values Hofstede model of national culture. Second is the Gold Project. And third is the Relationship Orientations Trompner's 7-dimension culture model. These are the three main ones, but for now, let's focus on the Hofstede. Each dimension is on a spectrum with two extremes at each end. Let's focus on power distance. In high power distance cultures, we see respect for authority, unequal distribution of power, and are typically cultures that respect the opinions of the boss without question. In low power distance cultures, individuals see each other as equals, open communication is much more likely, and power distribution is equal. In the dimension of uncertainty avoidance, we are focusing on the extent to which people feel threatened by ambiguity. In countries that are high on this spectrum, we see stricter laws, and people tend to follow them closely. These countries also have a strong sense of nationalism. In countries that are low, nationalism is less pronounced, and there is less formal structure, and people are more likely to take risks, embracing change. On the individualism and collectivism spectrum, the dimension speaks for itself. It's a focus on how people look after themselves and society as a whole. In individualistic countries such as the United States, people focus primarily on the individual and immediate family. It's much more about personal achievement and societies that have people who behave independently. Collectivist countries place an emphasis on group achievements, and there's a focus on both extended family and society as a whole. There are tight social frameworks, and harmony is valued. This can be summed up as the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. In the fourth dimension, masculinity/femininity, we're focusing on what are considered traditionally masculine traits, which are assertiveness, materialism, and lack of concern for others, while comparing that to that of traditionally feminine traits, such as conflict resolution skills, less assertiveness, and an emphasis on nurturing behaviors. In countries with low masculinity, such as Switzerland and New Zealand, there's less conflict and more women in high-level jobs. An example of a masculine type country would be that of Japan and Austria. Finally, comparing short-term and long-term orientation cultures. This was a dimension later created by Hofstede, and he defined it as the extent to which a culture programs its members to accept delayed gratification of their needs, which basically means long-term countries strive toward long-term goals, whereas short-term orientation cultures focus on quick results and profitability. U.S. is a great example of a short-term orientation culture, compared to that of China, which is a long-term orientation culture. We're going to be using this model in the Best Country Fairy Tale assignment. The second cultural framework model is the Globe Project, which is quite similar to the Hofstede framework. However, it adapts and breaks up more of the dimensions to the point where we now have 9 different cultural dimensions. The first 6 that we'll list here, you can probably see are really similar to the Hofstede ones that we saw before. Note that collectivism is broken up into institutional, collectivism 1, and in-group, collectivism 2. The Globe Project analysis mostly confirms Hofstede's research with a greater emphasis on differences in managerial leadership styles. These 6 aspects kind of basically relate back to the 5 aspects that we saw before. The Globe Project, however, does have 3 more new and exciting aspects and dimensions that they focus on. They focus on assertiveness, performance orientation, and humane orientation. There are more detailed descriptions of these dimensions in your book, if you feel like you want to check them out. The final cultural framework model that we're going to be learning is Trompenau's 7-dimension culture model. The first dimension is universalism versus particularism, which is how people apply rules to either individualistic situations or universally. Then individualism versus communitarianism, similar to individualistic versus collectivistic societies. Neutral versus emotional, which is how people deal with emotional orientation in relationships. Then either specific versus diffuse, which is if people separate their personal life from their work. Achievement versus ascription. Sequential versus synchronous, which deals with time and deadlines. And then inner versus outer directed environments.
For more information on this model, pause the video and check out the link above.
Taking these cultural framework models, to develop cultural profiles, managers start gathering considerable info from current research, personal observation, and discussion with people. In this next step, they develop cultural profiles of various countries. In the last step, they take these profiles and anticipate drastic differences in a given country. In a best-case scenario, one of the managers or somebody has lived in and formed connections with people of the culture, so they best understand the situation. All in all, it's important for us to understand that cultural differences can lead to drastic consequences if they aren't handled correctly. We as managers have ways to understand these cultural differences through framework models we use, and even without the framework models, it is best to at least take a step back and think, dogs, food, or pet?